microphone turned off, so it was just me walking around. There we go. All right, so your sense of humor. What an arbitrary thing to try to define. We say these words all the time, like, I think she has a really good sense of humor, but what in the heck do you mean when you say something like that? So that's what today is all about, defining a sense of humor, and then you're going to learn how to actually assess it in yourself and somebody else. So I could have just put two things we know, but instead, for some reason, I wrote out one thing we know and one other thing we know. One thing that we know, let's start here. What's something about you that doesn't really change much over time? Because I'm asking it in the form of a question. Yeah.
Your personality.
Your personality. Your personality is a set of traits within you that, for all intents and purposes, doesn't change very much over time. Your personality is essentially who you are. More on that in about 5 or 6 minutes. But your personality, one thing we know for sure, your personality is a set of traits that is very stable over time. The other thing that we know is that people consistently describe a sense of humor as a positive personality trait in people. What are you looking for in a perfect mate? When we ask questions like that, a good sense of humor, whatever that means to someone, is usually in the top 3 responses that both males and females say. Doesn't matter who you're looking for, or what kind of person you're looking for, everyone seems to want to find someone that has a good sense of humor. When we ask you to describe someone else, it's a common thing. You say, oh, she's outgoing, she's laid back, she has a really good sense of humor. So we use this, we think of this as a personality trait in someone. So, moving forward, downward on the PowerPoint slide. So one way we could think about defining a sense of humor would be a set of loosely related personality traits. So if we know personality is stable over time, we know that we consistently describe a sense of humor as a positive personality trait, then one way we could try to define it, and we'll get there eventually, one way we could try to define it would be as a set of loosely related personality traits. In fact, people in the humor research field have been trying to do this for decades. We think we're finally there. Maybe we'll shift, but it took us about 100 years, but I think we finally got to a place that we all agree on. Now, this last little thing on this slide will sound very familiar. It's a very tiny list that I think you've written out 5 or 6 different ways in different forms for different reasons. How is your sense of humor consistent? Well, your personality is consistent. How is your personality consistent? It's consistent in 3 very stable ways over time. In other words, there's things about you with regards to humor that will still be the same 45 years from now. The first is what types of humor you seem to appreciate. That seems to be, we've studied that. That seems to be very consistent over time. Your ability to create humor seems to be consistent over time. In other words, if you're not very good at it now, it's likely you're not going to be very good at it when you're 68 years old. And you'll still be cracking the same kind of jokes that you do now. Unless well, we'll get to that eventually. There actually is classes you can take. You can actually learn to be funnier. I think a lot of people that know nothing about this class think that's what this class is yay! Sorry. And the last way that you're very consistent is how much you use it in your daily life. You all know someone who seemingly has no sense of humor because you've never seen them laugh or even smile. You know it's in there somewhere. They just keep it a secret. All right, that's step one to this story. Step number two to this, and for some people in this room, this will be a little bit of review, but that's perfectly fine. You're just going to need to lay back and assimilate the information. See what I did there? You use your schema and assimilate it. But for some people, this will be new, but we need to lay the groundwork for this, just like we did with Piaget and some other people. Before we start defining your sense of humor as a set of personality traits, we need to first define what your personality actually is. So let me give you the textbook definition. I can paraphrase, but I like the way that they put it in this book. So your personality, this is what it is. Who are you? It's your habitual way. On Tuesday, I forgot it was on the slide. Today, I remembered because I catch on to things. It's your habitual way of thinking, reacting, feeling, and perceiving the environment around you. So it's your habitual way of thinking of things, the way you perceive things, the way you interact with, and the way you react to the environment around you. Thinking, reacting, feeling, perceiving. That's what your personality is. In other words, that's why I put that up there. You might not like it about yourself, but in many ways, you are extraordinarily predictable because of your personality. In other words, when you find yourself in certain situations, you typically, not all the time, that's why it says habitually, but you typically react and respond and perceive things in a very consistent, predictable way. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just who you are. So you might be sitting out there wondering, in what ways am I so consistent and predictable? And what makes this up? Well, some of you have probably heard of this before. If you took Psych 110, you probably went over it in some fashion. There's different ways that psychologists can explore your personality, but by far the most common one, and the one that's probably the most reliable, is what's known as the big 5 factors, the trait theory of personality. The big 5 factors about you that are very consistent over time. In fact, if you've ever taken one of those, you probably shouldn't click on this because it's probably a Russian spy. Like, which Harry Potter character are you on Facebook? I knew it! That they're giving you a very brief personality test, and guess what it's based on? This. It gets known as the ocean model, because there's 5 of them. You can also call it the canoe model. But it typically gets described as the ocean model of personality. I'm sure some of you have heard this before, but for some people, and I can tell by the look on your face, you've never heard this before. And if you have, you've forgotten what it is altogether. So the 5 ways that you're consistent over time. We look into the ocean to find this. Here's the fun thing about this. See what I did there? Here's the fun thing about this. When you're a kid, we can actually assess kids using the ocean model. And from the ages of about 5 to about 15 or so, we see a lot of movement. In other words, your assessment changes quite a bit. But then something happens. By the time you reach about 15 to 18 years old, it stops changing. And you start becoming very reliable and predictable. It's almost as if your personality starts to get set as you reach maturity, which makes sense. So let's go through these. I don't want to belabor this too much because then we'll get to the humor part, but you do at least need to understand what these are. So the ocean, the big 5 factors on all of these, and you can see what I've done here, and I'll just do it myself. I'll assess myself as we go. Actually, it becomes part of humorology too. So in your notes somewhere, just maybe make something like this, or do whatever it is that you'd like to do. Just a quick, doesn't need to be exactly precise, but as we described it, I want you to think about yourself and how you would rate yourself. So just be honest. No one's going to look at your notes and find it. But this will become part of humorology too, this quick personality self-assessment. Like I said, I'll play along and I'll assess myself as we go. So the ocean model. If you've never heard this before, you might be surprised how many common terms we use are actually related to this. So on the O, I would put myself, well, probably up here. And by the way, on all of these, you rate, it's kind of cool. You rate yourself kind of low to high. I always think of it as like a musical chord like you create, right? You might be low on this one, high on that one, et cetera, et cetera. It might be all over the place. But by the time of now, you're 18 to 21, that ball has probably stopped moving. And the fun thing is I could go back, I'd find you when you're 90 years old and assess you, and it looks exactly the same. It just doesn't seem to budge. So what's the O? I know, sir.
Openness.
I don't think you talk that way. Openness, you're correct. Openness. So what in the world does that mean? You got the word right. What?
I said I know all of them, but not for sure.
Oh, well, good then. Then you will accommodate something. I'm going to modify my schema. Openness. So have you ever heard the terms liberal and conservative? Of course you have. But we're not talking about it in a political sense at all. If you didn't know, it's kind of unfortunate that those words have been slapped into the political realm and fought over, because this is actually where those words come from. You're considered liberal if you rate very highly on the O, on the openness scale. What this means is you have a very open mind. You're open to new ideas. You're open to change. In fact, you might like it quite a bit. If you rate yourself low on this, it has nothing to do with who you vote for. How open to new ideas are you? How open to change are you? If you just like things very consistent and the same and safe, you would rate yourself lower on this. Conservative, liberal. I used to drive my mom crazy as a kid. I used to rearrange the furniture in my room at least once every 2 weeks because it made my room new. I just had to change it all the time. Something about it made me just feel better. That's probably a very silly example to use. I'm not even sure how appropriate it is, but open to change and new ideas. What's the C stand for? And by the way, I'm pretty low on this one. Cassidy.
Conscientious.
Oh my gosh, you do know it. Okay, conscientiousness. Use your own spell check for that one. Conscientiousness. Dominic's actually doing it. What is this? So I rate myself fairly low on this. If you're really super highly conscientious, what does that mean about you? To the extreme, you would be a perfectionist. Everything has to be in its place. Everything has to be in the right order. Rules are very important to be followed. Have you ever heard of a type A personality? That's where this comes from. Type A's rate very highly, really highly on C. Type B's rate very low on the C. Type D's, more laid back. Not that type B, I think type B's get a bad rap. I'll speak for myself. It's not that order isn't important. Of course it is. Of course rules are important, but whatever. Whereas a type A would get, some anxiety would get created if things were out of place. Again, I'm talking about like an extreme. We're all somewhere in the middle. I mean, most of us are somewhere. Then we have extremes that, right? You can also be too laid back. That's a thing. How about the E? I know you've all heard of this one. Now we're back up here. Someone other than this page. Any ideas? Maisie, you know what these are.
Is it extroversion?
It is extroversion, not the olive oil. Extroversion, exactly. So this is where we get our classic terms, extrovert, introvert. So you rate very highly on this. What exactly does that mean? Extroverts thrive on being around other people. They like being in crowds. They like being the center of attention. I hate that. In other words, someone who rates highly on this is going to try out for the lead in the school play. If you rate low on this, you're going to try out for only stage crew. That's it. You'd rather be backstage doing this, not out there in front of everyone else. Introverts get a really bad rap. I think people think introverts are sad and miserable and have no sense of humor. Yeah, no. But it's hard for someone who's a real extrovert to understand that's actually what they enjoy. Like, that's actually what I enjoy. But just think of yourself in this regard. The A. 3 people on Tuesday, by the way, did not understand that joke. Maybe none of you do either. You don't seem like you do. I'll just let it sit up there. Just think about it. What is the A? I rated myself pretty highly on this. Again, some classic terms I know you've heard. Piece of cake. Sitting right by the ocean. The A.
I think it was always supposed to be a joke. I thought I should advise up there.
I know.
Now that I think
I understand. You just still don't get it. It's okay. We'll come back before we leave today and we'll explain. So the A, she still doesn't get it. Now someone else just figured it out. It's terrible. I don't know why I did it. Anyway, what does the A stand for? Pretty high on this. You're high on the A. There's a classic scene in a classic funny movie. I feel like I show it, part of it in this class for some reason, but I don't remember why, so this is going to sound odd. You ever seen Life of Brian? It's an old movie from a comedy troupe out of Europe called Monty Python. Maybe you've heard of them, but they've made a couple movies they've become famous for, but one of them is Life of Brian. And to make a long story short, we're back in biblical times, and a guy, just a normal average guy named Brian, gets mistaken for being the Messiah. He's not Jesus. Jesus exists in the timeline, so it's canon. But just this random guy named Brian starts getting followed by people, and he's like, what in the hell? So it's as if if Jesus is over here and regular Brian is over here, instead of people following Jesus, they end up following Brian in the film, and that's kind of the joke. But at the end of the film, the classic scene in Life of Brian is at the very end, and of course we know, according to the story of Christianity, Jesus gets crucified on the cross, and at the very end there's Brian on the cross. He's being crucified with like 10 other people. And instead of being sad, they all start singing a song called "Let's All Look on the Bright Side of Life," and they're whistling and they're happy. That's about as A as you could get. A, agreeableness, means having a positive outlook on life versus having a negative outlook on life. So this is where we get our terms optimist and pessimist. You see this, you're learning all of this. That's where that comes from. And that's how long the big 5 factors have been around, and how much they've infiltrated our society and the way we think about people, right? Some people are just optimists, some people are pessimists. Where would you put yourself? Do you see the best in people? Do you see the best in the world no matter what? Or do you kind of have more of a negative tint on things? I don't know. And then last but not least, and I think if I'm completely honest, I'd probably put myself somewhere in the middle. That's probably cheating. But the N, anyone know what this stands for? Yeah.
Narcissism?
Oh, thank you. I don't know. It's actually neuroticism.
Oh.
It's close.
Whoops.
Dr. Meyer is somewhat of a narcissist. Maybe. So neuroticism. What neuroticism means is to what degree, so if you want to describe the high. High extremes are, well, think of the term neurotic. Have you heard that word? Where we get this? How would you describe someone who's neurotic? Like, what does that mean about them? Like, quit being so neurotic. You're so neurotic. You get the joke yet?
No, I can't listen to what you're saying because I'm thinking about
Oh my God.
It's a song.
Cake by the Ocean.
The song.
Oh. Okay.
They said now we can focus.
That wasn't it, that
How big did you think it
I
was?
was expecting a lot more.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry. All right.
Anyway, just Google it or something. So neuroticism, if someone's neurotic, they're always worrying, right? They're always really anxious. That's good being so neurotic about something. Neuroticism means your tendency to experience negative emotions. How easily stressed out do you get? How easily anxious do you get? How irritable do you get? There was a time in my life when that was a lot higher. This is a part of my personality that's probably changed a little bit over time. So just to be safe, though, I'm putting myself in the.
So if you're on the left side, does that mean you're less likely to get?
Yes, you don't really get anxious, worried, upset. All right, so you've just given yourself some type of personality profile, and we can move on, and eventually you'll understand why we did that, especially when you get to the assignment. So again, this is a question that's been tormenting the field of human research for a while, from how do you just define humor? It took us a long time to get there. You know, humor itself now has like this dual definition. It's both doing something, but it's also enjoying something. It can be both at the exact same time. So how many senses of humor are there? I think this would be a good time to do this, actually. This will only take a few. It's in 12-point font, and it's only 4 questions. There's no back. This next part is just a brief history lesson. We're not going to do all the stops along the way of how the way we've defined what a sense of humor has changed and how we've assessed it has changed. And the way we've assessed it has changed along with how we've defined it. So, go. Remember the good old days when we just like lick the paper? I should never. I understand why some teachers do it, but paper just sticks together. But I was always the kid who would get the piece of paper, the teacher would go, I'm like, no. Something about the pandemic needs to stay. There we go. All right, so with each of these, just read the description. Maybe read all the descriptions first. And just rank yourself. 4 different, I guess, styles of humor. 1 would be the one that's most like you, and 4 is the one that's least like you. So find yourself. You'll be giving this, incidentally, to someone else, too. All right. We have ourselves ranked. So hold on to this. Circle back to this. So the reason that up there, not only did they make me laugh. So the first way we defined humor, we're going back several decades. The first crack at defining a sense of humor was pretty straightforward and pretty simple. People in the humor research field defined your sense of humor as how much do you appreciate humor? That's pretty much it. The higher you appreciated it, the more, we almost saw a sense of humor as like a quantifiable thing. The more humor you appreciate, the bigger and better your sense of humor is. What's peculiar is how they decided to test it. Because that sounds like part of it. Okay, I would agree that what type of humor you appreciate is part of your sense of humor, but here's how they tested it. But give them some slack. This was the first crack. The mirth response test. Not going to take this one. Well, one, it would take too long, and two, there's no record of it. I can't find it anywhere. So the mirth response test. This was 36 cartoons that were presented to individuals, both men and women. Now, the peculiar thing about them is every single one of them relied on tendential humor, which now you know what that means. We're going in the way back machine here. This is in the heyday of Freud. So now that we've laid the groundwork in this class, you understand what Freud's theory of humor was all about. And you understand what tendential wit is, right? It's humor that relies on either sexual themes or aggressive themes. Every single one of these cartoons, to a degree, had some type of sexual or aggressive theme to them, some being more extreme than others. But they all relied on that. But the reason they did that is because Freud's influence, right? This is all we were kind of thinking of, was tendential humor. And they ended up with two major categories and then one peculiar category. So we define your sense of humor, you would be labeled as either what we call libidinal or safe. There are two types of a sense of humor. Libidinal were people who enjoyed the cartoons, they appreciated them a lot more. So they found a lot of humor in them. You rated each cartoon on a scale of 1 to 10, you ended up with a score of 300. That was considered a good thing. You have a very robust, libidinal sense of humor. The other category were considered safe. And these were people who rated very low. I have to self-admit, I'm not sure what the cutoff was. All I know is that there was another significant amount of people who didn't really enjoy the jokes all that much. The ones that they did enjoy would have been the ones with very mild sexual and aggressive themes. And this is why we did the ocean work. There was some very distinct correlations to a person's personality. People of the libidinal, so think of yourself and how you might rate some of these jokes, scored very high on the E and very high on the O. That sounds like me. So there is a very positive correlation between scoring high on extroversion and openness and enjoying humor of a sexual/aggressive nature. If you didn't catch on, the little e and the little o means you scored very low on the e and the o. So they found this consistent correlation. People who were the more extroverted and the more openness you had, the more you enjoyed this type of humor. The more introverted and the more conservative you were, you didn't enjoy this sense of humor. And then a really peculiar finding was people that scored really high on the N didn't seem to enjoy any humor at all. They scored the lowest. I'm actually going to make the list about the issues a little bit shorter. So, is this truly capturing one sense of humor? No. If it was, we would have stopped here. I mean, come on. So the issues are, one, pretty obvious. They're relying solely on humor that's of a tendential quality, when there's so much more to pick from, so much more variation. Not to mention, they're also relying just on cartoons, right? Maybe you just don't, and is that your thing? So I'm kind of just rewording things underneath the issues. The second issue is we don't know what parts of the humor people were laughing at. Were they laughing at the sexual and aggressive themes to it, or was there something else about the cartoon that was funny? Meaning, but this is the example that I gave on Tuesday. We all sometimes laugh at things that we know we shouldn't. There's an aggressive theme to it, and we still find it funny. And then last but not least, just to make this shorter, this is all based off of Freud's theory, and only Freud's theory of humor, which was a wonderful starting point. That's why I say it was a start. But we've expanded our knowledge and thinking about what makes up people's humor and what they enjoy since then. But this is where we started. So you would either get described as libidinal or safe, unless you're a neurotic, then you just have no sense of humor whatsoever. But this is when people started using wording like that, like, oh, she has no sense of humor. You're a neurotic. But we did move on. And we're leaping ahead of time, and we're skipping maybe a couple generations, but this is where you come in and what you did before. We started to move away from just tendential humor, and we started to change the way that we defined a sense of humor. The SHRQ, the CHS. There's another test that I decided not to pound you with too many self-assessments. The MSHS is another one that's very similar to these, kind of gauges how much you would laugh in certain situations. So the SHRQ and the CHS, the coping humor scale, the situational humor response scale, these two scales, along with some others, came at a time what's known as the humor research boom. That sounds kind of silly, but there was a humor research boom in the 70s, the late 70s and the early 80s. Incidentally, a guy named Norman Cousins, remember that name? You probably have a book by him that we're going to crack open in a couple weeks. A guy by the name, you don't need to write this down, but a guy by the name of Norman Cousins wrote a book about humor, and it got people, doctors, the medical field, it got everyone really excited about humor and taking humor seriously. So people, it had been a while. It's almost like the humor shells were gathering dust. No one had really studied humor in a long time. And finally, the world of psychology was like, hey, let's revisit this. So they dusted off some of the old books, and all they found was Freud. And they said, we need to update the way we define a sense of humor and also how we assess it. These two scales became powerhouses in the field. If you took any study, look at any study, like literally between like 1980 and maybe 2001, almost every single one, even if it's not related, they just included these two just to make sure that they assess someone on the CHS, because that's how we defined a sense of humor. So step number 2 in our story, we defined a sense of humor by 2 things. How much you laugh in certain situations. In other words, how much is humor a part of your daily life? And how much do you use humor to cope with stress and anxiety? Going back to you, you made kind of a nice segue without meaning to. You scored a 70 on the SHRQ. Congratulations. Does that mean you have a better sense of humor than someone else in the room? Well, but back then, we would say yes, because you scored higher. The higher you would score on assessments like this, you were considered to have, just like with the Mirth response test, well, libidinal was good, right? Well, the higher you score on these, in other words, the more you use humor to deal with stress and anxiety, and the more you laugh in certain situations, was considered to be signs of a more robust, healthy sense of humor. We call that the positivity bias. So the positivity bias is the thinking that with humor, the more the better, the more the better, the more the better, the higher you score on this, the higher you score on that. So let's just take a second and talk about these 2 skills really briefly. So what's our personality correlates here? We're also planting a seed here for something we'll talk about in the coming weeks. So this next part. We can just sum this up. Both the CHS and the SHRQ seem to be pretty reliable. The CHS does seem to assess how much you use humor in stressful situations. And the SHRQ does, to some degree, seem to assess how much you would laugh in your daily life. In other words, people that score highly on the SHRQ, when we observe them, they do seem to just simply laugh more. They find more humor in their universe. When we look at someone's personality and how they score on these, there's only one part of a person's personality, one letter of the ocean that this is connected to, and it seems to be the E. The higher someone scores in terms of extroversion, the higher they score on both of these scales. So just to recap really quick before we go any further, we got the positivity bias that says the more the better, the higher you score the better. More equals better. Great sense of humor. We started off with appreciation, then we moved into how often do you use it and when and what situations. How often do you use it to cope? But again, the question is, are we truly capturing your sense of humor by simply understanding how much you might use it to cope with anxiety? People started asking the question of what a sense of humor is in a slightly different way. Hold on, make a little bit of a segue. Because people in the humor research field started to rethink humor a little bit, because certainly it's a positive personality trait, right? Yes. But is it possible that too much of some types of humor could be a bad thing? Is that possible? That's exactly what people in the humor research started to think. They started to think, wait a second, like humor is great, but this positivity bias thing, the idea that more is better, that's true sometimes, but maybe it's not true all of the time. And here's where we loop back to Chris Farley.
There's a basic meaning is the most common. It's like a love relationship with the audience. When you're on stage, you're doing really well, and you're killing, and they're giving back to you. There's this odd warmth you get from this group of strangers, which shows you that like most comedians I know have very low self-esteem, just by the nature of the job.
I said to the guy, I said to the guy, I said to him, he's standing right there, get it.
Chris Farley had it. He had that gift. He had this manic energy that was completely grounded in reality. It couldn't have been any bigger, yet 100% believable.
Everything okay? No problem, just have a heart attack. Oh my God!
Chris Farley was in the vanguard of a new trend for sort of dumb, physical, crazy slapstick comedy. Comedy you don't have to think about, not topical.
All right, how's everybody?
Matt Foley, I think, is probably his character was most well known. You know, Chris really has because it just showcases his really crazy energy.
I am 35 years old. I am divorced, and I live in a van down by the river.
Oh, what an idiot! If you look at the sketches on SNL, the Chris Farley show, that sketch is just brilliant on so many levels, because it's a guy that you're laughing hysterically at, but you feel sorry for him. You want to like give him a big hug. You remember Beatlemania? Where those four guys, they dressed up on stage and they looked like you, and then they played Beatles songs, and God, that was awesome.
Born in Madison, Wisconsin in 1964, Chris was the second of 5 kids in a boisterous Irish Catholic household. Like his contemporary Phil Hartman, Farley used his comic gifts to stand out in his big family.
His dad was this very outgoing, gregarious salesman who was larger than life, had this deep, booming voice, and the kids just, were in awe of him. He was the Lion King. Chris looked up to his dad in every way.
There's an early story about Chris Farley. He was watching Animal House with his dad, saw his dad just very hardly belly laughing and Belushi, and he realized that he could get his dad's attention by making him laugh. In his own family, he was the class clown at a very young age. His brothers described him as a wind-up toy, meaning they could go tell him to do something, any prank, and he would just go do it, just to entertain the family.
Pranks, pratfalls, punchlines, they became Chris's way to get noticed at home. But there was another way to fit in the Farley household: drinking.
Alcoholism ran in the family, and Chris was an addict from the first beer. When they were 17, they'd be walking out the house, and Dad would say, "Here's $20, go buy a 6-pack for your friends." Part of being this gregarious guy was the guy who could buy our own drinks, and Chris looked up to that personality of having to be the biggest person in the room.
In 1982, Chris entered Marquette University in Milwaukee, where he began performing in school talent shows and doing stand-up at open mic nights. After graduation in 1987, Chris moved to the mecca for upstart comedians, Chicago, to apprentice in some of the city's most hallowed comedy theaters, including the famed Improv Olympic, but he couldn't wait for his moment in the spotlight.
After a few weeks of working with me, he came up to me at the theater and he said, "Let me go up tonight." It was right before a show. Let me go up. And he was just really adamant, like pounding the walls and come on like a little child. But I was like, "You're not even ready yet." And he was just getting so angry. And I was like, "All right, you want to walk on stage? I'll tell you what, you can walk tonight, but if you go up and you screw up, you will never get on my stage again." But you know what? He just wanted to play so bad, it didn't even scare him. He was hysterical that night. And he came up to me like a puppy dog afterwards, like, "Is that okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, you were good."
Within 2 years, he moved up to Second City, the comedy troupe where stars like Bill Murray and John Belushi got their start. While Chris's career was on a fast track, his drug and alcohol use were on the rise as well.
The drug use escalated when we got to Chicago, not so much because it was encouraged, but because it was just allowed. His lifestyle, he didn't have to be at work till 4 in the afternoon, and several of the other members of the cast were addicts, and the drugs got harder.
In 1990, after a mere 2 years in Chicago, Chris landed a spot on the cast of Saturday Night Live, and Chris would do whatever it took, no matter how demeaning, to please his new audience.
I remember when he first got his job on Saturday Night Live, he called me up. Patrick Swayze was the guest, and they were going to be making him dance against Patrick Swayze, and those that making fun of the fat guy. And he was sad. He was upset. It was like one of his first shows. And I said, "Chris, but you know what? You're an amazing dancer. You have great control. You don't worry about being fat. Just be right on your feet and be the best dancer that you can be."
He has two ideas in his head at the same time. One being, he hates being the fat guy that people laugh at. He hated when people laughed at his dad for being overweight. But it was the thing that brought in the most laughs for him. So that sketch really summed up so much about Chris.
He was the old anything for a laugh mentality, which can have its sort of sad side. Someone who really will do anything for a laugh. It was that constant need for attention and acceptance, but it must have had a very harsh effect on his own psyche and his own self-image.
We're gonna do Dr. Jack, but we'll.
Farley's by any means necessary brand of comedy was making him a star on Saturday Night Live.
Oh yeah!
But while his star was rising, Chris's drug and alcohol use was as well. At age 26, Chris Farley had risen through the Chicago Comedy Club circuit to land a spot on the cast of Saturday Night Live. He was quickly becoming one of the show's most popular performers. But with fame came an increasing appetite for drugs and alcohol.
When you're involved with comedy, it's not hard to find things like cocaine, and you find it helps performances. And when you have that addictive personality to begin with, especially what Chris had, it's sort of the perfect storm. Going to Saturday Night Live is the dream of everyone, and there's nothing Chris wouldn't do. And if that meant taking drugs to stay up, and not just up, but he had to be maniacally up. That dream was so all-consuming for him that I think he would do whatever.
I think he felt like he had to be on, and I think that he felt like drinking and drugs helped him to be on. I remember one time going to visit him on the set of Saturday Night Live, and that's when I noticed his level of drinking and drug use had escalated to the point where I dropped out in the middle of the night. Like, I'm just going to go back to the hotel room and go to bed. And he was calling my hotel room, just trying to get me to come back out. And I just stopped answering the phone. And I just remember thinking, oh, wow, that's kind of hardcore.
When Chris would be at a bar, he didn't just drink. He turned the glass upside down and it would just fall down his face. Because he just had to get down there, pound those beers to get up. And I'd be like, Chris, no one's taking it away from you, man. Slow down,
In the summer of 1991, he returned to Second City for what should have been a triumphant homecoming appearance.
Chris would build up a crazy tolerance to the point where he would get so drunk and so sloppy that he wasn't even making sense anymore. And so I think that kind of came to a head when he returned to Second City after a couple of years in New York.
He was really drunk and had done a lot of drugs and went up on stage at Second City, and everyone had begged him not to do it. He just went up there anyway, and he just wasn't funny. And people were yelling and booing and yelling because he was drunk off the stage. And that's when I think he first realized that maybe he had a problem.
I talked to him about what he was doing, and he promised me he would die. I said, if you die, I'll follow you to the depths of hell. And he's like, Jesus, I'm gonna die.
Directly after, Chris checked himself into a 28-day rehab program in Minnesota. But when he returned to New York for his second season on Saturday Night Live, he couldn't resist his old vices. And this time, drug and alcohol use nearly cost Chris his dream job.
The summer before he went back to Saturday Night Live for his third season, Lorne Michaels was like, I'm not happy. Did it with John. I buried him. I'm not going to do it again. And you go to rehab and get clean and come back and stay clean or you're out.
His manager called me because they were having trouble with him. And Warren was telling them, if he doesn't straighten up, I'm going to fire him. They said, if you're one of the few people Chris listens to, you got to get him to stop drinking. And so the first thing I did was call his parents. And I said, we have to help him. When he comes home, there's no drinking. We have to really all set this example. So we get out and start drinking. And the father refused. And he goes, well, I don't have to stop. It's not my problem. He wanted Chris to be okay, but he did not want to have to stop. And I couldn't believe it.
In 1992, during Chris's third season on Saturday Night Live, network executives compelled him to enter rehab in Alabama. The program was no weekend resort. Chris endured a military-style detox regime, and he seemed to make a turn for the better. Chris starred in hit films like Black Sheep and Tommy Boy. In January of 1997, Chris's third film, Beverly Hills Ninja, opened to box office success. But the critics panned him. Chris was just as hard on himself.
I remember Chris telling me Beverly Hills Ninja was a hit, but he wasn't happy about it. I'm just a bad ninja, cry chopper. It was just take it for what it is. It's funny and people liked it, but he felt like he had his peak. And I told him, I said, look, you hang in there. But he didn't hang in there. He didn't hang in there.
Disappointed by Beverly Hills Ninja, Chris relapsed. And over the next several months, he entered and dropped out of rehab several times, struggling to break himself of his deadly habits. Then in October 1997, a visibly intoxicated Chris Farley returned to host Saturday Night Live.
He showed up at Rockefeller Center with two prostitutes. He was doing drugs while trying to write and very overweight. People thought he was going to have a heart attack. There was discussion about whether or not the show should go forward. And in terms of his performance and the perception of it. It was not good.
In December of 1997, just 2 months after that final Saturday Night Live appearance, Chris returned home to Chicago. On December 14th, he embarked on a 4-day binge.
He just proceeded to party. And he, would go out to bars and he would meet all these, people who want to party with Chris Farley. At that point, he was still the guy who would do anything for a laugh. And, if he was surrounded by a bunch of his fans and they wanted to buy him a drink and have fun, he'd go for it. And so that went on for 3 days.
The binge ended on the night of December 17th when Chris ingested a massive dose of cocaine and morphine and collapsed in his apartment.
We met a prostitute, she was getting high with her, and she just left him. And she called the ambulance, and maybe he would be okay today, but she was so scared about getting arrested for something illegal.
The day Chris died, I was waiting for him. He was taking me to lunch, and he never showed up. And I knew that something had to be wrong, and that was the day they found him.
On December 18th, 1997, John Farley found his brother Chris dead in his Chicago apartment. Chris was 33 years old.
I think partly we expected it at some point, but we didn't expect it that soon. I know I was in shock. It was just such a waste. And this boy who could have everything, and there he is, buried underground.
That was the tragedy of his life, that he had this wonderfully innocent personality that made him so popular and made him such a great performer, but also rendered him incapable of dealing with very serious problems that he had.
Chris Farley, to me, is one of the funniest people of our generation. He's just one of those people that just can walk into a room and make everyone laugh. It just radiated off. And he was a genuinely nice guy, too.
As a repairman, I hear a lot of folks say they feel like they have to rinse off dirty dishes like these before loading them into the dishwasher.
Come back to this in a second. So it was actually stories like this. I think Chris Farley was probably the tipping point. You guys weren't even around when this happened, but it was huge tragedy, in the entertainment industry, and it actually inspired the author of your textbook to start considering maybe there's a dark side of comedy that we've been ignoring. And people know this is true of people that, in other words, you can use humor in positive ways, absolutely, but humor can also be a weapon. We've known this for a long time. It's kind of interesting looking back to know that we kind of ignored this for so long in the field of humor research. So the author of your textbook, Rod Martin, hold on, we'll come back to Adam in a second, was one of the first people in the humor research field to say, no, look, there's positive forms of humor, there's negative forms of humor. They're all probably part of us to some degree, but we all differ in what degree we carry these traits with us. So now we get to circle all the way back to where we started, and hopefully this will finally make sense. We know your sense of humor is something that's stable about you, and we defined it in your first part of your notes as a set of loosely related personality traits. Well, in front of you, well, maybe it's not directly in front of you, but that little thing you just ranked yourself on are the 4 different, so just like the cognitive congruency principle was superimposed on the zone of proximal development, right? What else? We got multiple meanings superimposed on conservation. Well, we have the humor styles superimposed on the ocean model of personality. There are 4 distinct styles of humor, 2 of which are positive, 2 of which are negative. And just like with the ocean model, you rate high or low on each of them. They're all a part of it. But some you might relate to really well, extremely well, and some not so much. So you, just like you have an ocean profile, you have a humor profile. The central question, well, that's why there's 2 questions here. The 2 negative ones use humor at the expense of either someone else or yourself. The 2 positive ones, humor is used to benefit either others or yourself. So that's the delineation between what we consider negative and what we consider positive. And they developed, I guess, what's today, like the latest and greatest assessment tool, which you'll use in Humorology Part 2. I don't have it with me today, but I provided it for you online, known as the HSQ. That's why I forgot that's up in the corner. The Humor Styles Questionnaire. The Humor Styles Questionnaire is what we use today to assess your sense of humor. And now we can all put it together. Your sense of humor being a set of loosely related personality traits, those personality traits being the 4 humor styles. So you can think of yourself, well, actually you did think of yourself, because I asked them to rank yourself. You've got wonderful definitions, so you don't even need to do the notes and write them down. The wonderful definitions are right there in front of you. And then I'll fill in some gaps, and here's where your personality profile will come in. So make sure you write these down and see how well you match up. By the way, you don't necessarily know what your humor style is yet. You think you might, but trust me, when people fill this out and then they take the HSQ, sometimes it lines up, but sometimes there's some differences. So this is just your pre-test guess on where you think you might fall. So the 2 negative ones, well, the aggressive one, of course, is the one at the bottom. That would be style number 4 in your sheet. The aggressive humor style. So you consistently, but remember our definition of humor. It's something you do, but also something you appreciate. So we just talk about appreciate. You would tend to appreciate humor, someone doing this style of humor. It's just funny when someone's getting mocked or made fun of, like mothers. Is it really the hardest job on the planet? Or is raking scallops off the bottom of the ocean a little bit harder than hanging out with kids all day? It's not my fault if others don't get the joke. Wit and sarcasm are tools that I use, right? So the aggressive humor style. Just write down that profile real quick. Because what you're going to see is if it matches you and if your personality profile matches what we see in the research. So high E, that's me. High N, I'm doing a self-assessment. Low A, that's not me. And low C, that is me. I've taken the HSQ many times. I've got a twinge of we all, again, the thing is, the HSQ is going to give you a score on all 4, okay? It's going to score, and you're not going to score 0 on any of them, right? There's always going to be a hint. I score relatively low on the aggressive, low to moderate on the aggressive style. I guess going back to our research on hostility, I seem to enjoy it, but to a degree. I think it can be taken too far, and I've never really liked comedians like Andrew Dice Clay. I'm not sure if you know who that is, but anyway. But the aggressive style. Chris Farley is the epitome, and this is what people started to think of, like, oh my gosh, why didn't we think about it this way? Chris Farley is the epitome of what's known as the self-defeating style, and that would be found in the second style on this. The defining characteristics of self-defeating is when humor is the only thing you seem to ever use to get inside others, social groups, friends. Now, it's wonderful to use that some of the time. Of course it is. But when you're using it all the time to an extreme. Chris Farley was also, I'm not sure if you caught it, how much you were paying attention, but every time I watch that Chippendales clip, I see it in an entirely different way than I did when I was a kid. I remember watching that with my best friend Donnie when it first aired live with Patrick Swayze, and I was in tears. This was our introduction to Chris Farley. I'd never seen anything like that, and it was hysterical. But now I know he was crying backstage and threw up before he had to go on because he didn't want to be the fat guy that people made fun of. He knew it would get laughs, but he hated it. And now every time I see that clip, I feel bad for laughing because I know what was going on inside his head. But he was using this. He's making people laugh at great psychological expense. There's nothing wrong with being self-deprecating. That's actually healthy, right, to a degree. But when you take it to the point where it's actually hurting you, that's what we call the self-defeating style. And it was hurting him. And last but not least on the self-defeating, there's a third part of it. Using humor as an emotional shield to not let anyone in ever. I mean, the old adage being, if you're the funny guy, no one's ever going to ask you if anything's wrong. Why would they? So humor can be a way to keep people at arm's length. If you're laughing and smiling, why would they ever assume something's wrong? Well, there's people sometimes use humor as a shield. They don't let anyone in because you never know who you're really talking to. Is that the real Chris or is that Chris being funny? My God, does he ever shut it off and just actually have a real serious conversation? No, that'd be too vulnerable. So using it like that is considered a negative quality. And there's one that's associated with that, planting a seed for later, really high on the end. Then we got our two positive styles. Affiliative is all about benefiting others. So that's our affiliative style. And this is the one, incidentally, that I kind of match up with really well. Myself, high on the O, high on the E, negative, trending negative towards the end. Show horses. The affiliative style. Out of curiosity, that's why I asked you to rank that in your notes. I'm curious what you put down. Did you rank aggressive higher or affiliative higher? And does that match up? This isn't part of humorology too. I was just playing around with it. And did that match up with what you actually found funnier? Did you find Bill Burr funnier, making fun of moms? Or did you find Brian Regan funnier, just making fun of show horses just to make you laugh? There's no real target of the humor. Brian Regan's clip is an example of, you're just trying to make people laugh. No one's a target. You're not putting anyone down. I mean, unless you have some kind of like personal thing against making fun of show horses. But you're literally just trying to make people laugh to help, to make them smile. That's affiliative humor. So you can see the definition. You use it to settle disagreements and just literally just to make people laugh and make their day better. And then, of course, we have self-enhancing. Now, this goes back to Freud's classic definition of humor. Using humor to cope. So this, incidentally, the CHS lines up perfectly with this. So to what degree do you use it for self-enhancement? Do you purposely use humor to cheer yourself up, to bring yourself up when you're stressed out? Do you use it specifically for that? Make sense? And then we can see the two. So thankfully, I kind of match up with these two. Incidentally, in a couple weeks, we'll get into mental health and humor and how they're related. Really, I just kind of make health in general. And you'll see how these humor styles are related in some pretty strong ways to different mental illnesses, et cetera, both the positive and the negative, how they can be protective factors and risk factors in somebody's life. All right, so real quick, let me just open this up. Since you're here, I was actually going to we actually didn't get this far on Tuesday. So for them, I'm going to make a little video. So first of all, first and foremost, before I get to say this out loud, the next 2 weeks are going to be really weird. Does anyone know why? Now I'm going to say, oh yes. Why are the next 2 weeks going to be weird? Yeah. So, but next week, the 4th, when this is actually due, that's why I'm giving you a little bit extra time on this. So nothing's due Sunday at midnight this week. You got until next Thursday to get this done. Thursday is with no classes. So if you didn't know that, no one's told you that, there are no classes next Thursday. Unless you're in one of those half semester classes. They're usually math classes, like 2 credit hours. That's their final day. So March 4th on Thursday is finals day for half semester classes. So there's no regularly scheduled class on the 4th. So that's next Thursday. So next Thursday or next Tuesday, we'll be doing our little split session thing. Right. So, and if someone in my other class needed to come earlier, if you need to come to Team A, that's fine. Just so it's something like you're doing something later, but let me know. So I'll email you about this. So split session on Tuesday. Well, then we got to turn around and do it again the next week too, because the 11th is your second spring break. Isn't it great? The pandemic gives you 2 spring breaks. That one is actually 2 days long, so maybe you could actually go somewhere. Just don't stay there very long. So you have Wednesday and Thursday off next week, the 10th and the 11th, if you didn't know. So 2 spring relax days. So what that means for us is going to be strange to have 2 weeks where we literally have 45 minutes together one week and 45 minutes the other week, so I guess I'll be making some online content, so yay. But that is what it is. So humorology 2, it looks like a lot, but it's actually very straightforward. It's all right here. Everything that you need is right here. Basically, you've already pre-ranked yourself. Let me just, it's very simple to describe. So you've got your pre-ranking of what you think your humostars are. Then the HSQ 32. There's 32 questions. It will assess and it'll spit out scores for each of the 4 humor styles. Does it match the rankings that you gave? In other words, if you said affiliative is definitely me, that's my one, that's definitely me. Well, does that match up? Does the HSQ tell you that the affiliative was the highest? Or does it say it's way down there? Like, is there a lineup between what you presume and what you actually score? So of course, being honest on this is important, right? So don't try to tweak it a little bit. And the scoring instructions, it's very simple. The scoring instructions just tell you which questions match up with which humor style. And there's a couple that are reverse scored and that sort of thing. So it's very straightforward. I wrote it all out. It'll make sense. Then the other part of this is doing this to someone that you know very well. Give them the pre-assessment. Hey, here's, what do you think? This is what we did in class. And then give them the actual one and see if it matched up. And then there's some thoughtful, reflective questions that I'll put in the discussion forum about having done this. So just like last time, 2 things to do. You'll put your, and again, when I say report, this is nothing dramatic. So your data, whatever you end up with, make a little document, just like you made, remember when you made the dissection and you made the little chart? So in some way, there's no perfect way to do it, but in some way, put that in the Dropbox just so I know that you actually did it. So what were the outputs of your HSQ 32 and your friend and that sort of thing? The second part will be the discussion forum, and all you've got to do is answer the reflection questions that are in. So just like last time, just something a little bit different. And now you'll know. In a week's time, you'll know what your sense of humor actually is, and someone that you know. Now before you go, since we did this, this is how I was hoping to end. Since we watched that, of course I screwed up.
Cauliflower chickpeas, cluck ya. Roasted chicken soup, rich goat broth.
After we get through this will be a nice send-off. And I will see you on Tuesday. I'll email you.
Yeah. Live well, don't compromise, eat right. Well, yeah.
Party. You know what I'm talking about.